We will resume our studies in the book of Genesis. And again, I want to say my thanks to those who filled in my absence, not just filled in, but did so ably. I appreciate that. But we'll pick up in Genesis chapter 20. Genesis chapter 20, just quickly, we have been introduced to one of the most main characters in all of the Bible, certainly of the Old Testament. We were first introduced to him by the name of Abram. By the time we get to chapter 20, his name has been changed to Abraham. He is so important because for basically two broad reasons. Number one is he is the father of the faithful. He is held up in Old and New Testament alike as an example of faith in God, but also because he is going to become the father of this nation, the father of the Israelite nation. And we're seeing that come to fruition. It doesn't look like it's going to happen from human standards, at least. In fact, even Abraham and Sarah have their doubts because he is childless. At first, he just has a servant that was born in his house. And by ancient standards, if by default, if you didn't have any other descendants, then that kind of became your de facto heir. But then Sarah comes up with a plan to have a descendant of Abraham. Remember, that was the initial promise, that just one of Abraham's descendants. And so maybe they saw an opening there to try to help God. And so Sarah gives her servant, her slave, Hagar, to Abram, have the son Ishmael. But God says, nope, that's not the descendant. He will be blessed. He will be a father of a nation, but he is not the promised child. Then remember, Abram has the heavenly guests that come and make the promise that about this time next year you will have that son. They go on to Lot's place in Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what we studied the last time, was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in chapter 20, we pick up the story of Abraham again. And so Abraham and this fellow by the name of Abimelech. Now, what we think is that the term Abimelech, we can't be confident of this, but it seems that most scholars seem to agree that Abimelech probably wasn't the man's name, that was a title, kind of like Pharaoh in Egypt, that Abimelech was a title. The word itself means my father is king. And so that was thought to be a term like Caesar, like Pharaoh, that was a title of a person, of a ruler. And so Abraham and Sarah go down into what's called the south, or the Negev, depending on your translation, is this territory south of the promised land. And they encounter this man, Abimelech, this ruler, Abimelech, king of Gerar. And what happens?
Abimelech tries to take Abraham's wife.
Okay. It's
Abraham claimed that his wife was his sister.
all right. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Haven't we heard this story before? Back over in chapter 12, remember? And if our accounting is right, it's about 20 years ago that this had happened before with Pharaoh. There's a little bit of differences in the stories. Just to let you know, some scholars, in fact, many scholars, think that this is just the same story being repeated again. And their reasoning is, surely he wouldn't do the same thing twice. And my thought when I was reading that is, have you ever met a human being? you know, that, and certainly 20 years separated. And so again, a little bit of differences. Abimelech seems to be a little bit better of a character than Pharaoh, and so God shows him some mercy in this. A couple things that I want to note in the story. We're not going to look at the details of the story unless there's something in there that strikes you. Look at verse 6 of Genesis chapter 20. Abimelech says, well, now wait a minute, I didn't touch her. And God says, yes, I know. In fact, I prevented you from touching her. Now, we don't know how that necessarily happened. But notice what it says in verse 6. God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that you did this in the integrity of your heart. In other words, you didn't know any better. For I also withheld you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. I found that language a little bit striking, not just sinning against Abraham. We would think adultery would be sinning against the husband of Sarah, but he says sinning against me. And so we recognize that all sin, including the sin of adultery, is not just a violation of our vow and sinning against our mate, which it certainly is both of those things, but God says this would have been sinning against me. And again, all sin is of that case. And then the second thing I want to note in verse 7, it says, now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet. A couple things about that word prophet. First of all, that's the first usage of it in Scripture, of the word prophet. And if we were using, before we read this chapter, if I'd have said list 5 or 10 things about Abraham, you probably prophet wouldn't have been one of them. Mine either. We just normally don't think of Abraham as a prophet. We think of him as a father of the faithful, the father of the Israel country, all kind of different things. But to refer to him as a prophet. Prophet, of course, is just simply the idea of someone who is a spokesman for God or on behalf of God. Now, here's to me the real question of this. Again, if our reckoning is right, these stories are separated by about 20 years. The incident with Abraham and Pharaoh, where a very similar incident happens, where they tell this half-truth, she is my sister, and leaves out the fact that she is also my wife in that. But what strikes me is, why are we being told these stories? I'm sure there's a lot in Abraham's long life. He's about 100 by now. And you think about how many stories have happened in his life, how many encounters he's had with other people, how many events have transpired, and they're not included. Really think about it, in 100 years of his life, we're told just very few things. The other ones are big things. We're told about his encounter with the angel and the promise of the son, the incident with Hagar. We understand, okay, those are big events in his life that get the story further down the line. But these two stories seem to be, I don't know, almost minor events, if you will, in the life of Abraham. And again, of all of the things that he must have done, and events and people, why these two stories? Why are we being told these strange events? Adam?
Humanize Abraham a little bit for us, that we want to put him up on a pedestal for being so great, but okay, not only did he kind of sort of lie once and it doesn't work for him, he's human enough, like you said, okay, I'm going to try it again. I think that makes him seem, more like, oh yeah, that's probably what I would have tried.
Yeah, to my knowledge, and you correct me if you know of a biblical character, and I'm talking about a biblical character that we have enough body of work. I'm not talking about one guy that, like Melchizedek, that we just have a brief encounter, but any biblical character that his story is long enough, we're always told their flaws. Moses, David, certainly Solomon, Paul, Peter. I can't think of a major biblical character that his flaws are excluded. And so maybe that's just the. Now, let me offer another possibility that I think we can quickly shoot down is maybe, Are we being told these stories to tell us that it's okay sometimes to lie? That Abraham's a good guy, and if he can do it, then I can do it. No, I don't think that's the reason that we're being told these stories. But I think maybe Adam's point there would seem to be one of the main reasons, is to show that even our heroes are human, they're flawed, and then we ask, well, then why are we told they're flaws? And maybe multiple reasons for that. Mark?
Could it be true that still tell the truth at all times?
Yeah, because we see negative fallout from both of these accounts, and so maybe rather than telling us it's okay to lie, because good man like Abraham does it to show it that you see how it messes things up, how it puts people's life at risk, and even draws them into sin. That's another interesting story. It seems to lesson from this that God does not allow Abimelech's ignorance as an excuse. Abimelech and Pharaoh both are held to accountable. What you're about to do is wrong. Well, I take Abimelech at his word. He seemed like a fairly honorable guy. I had no idea. Well, that doesn't matter. You're still wrong. And so how your lie pulls someone else into potential sin. Yeah, and how many people can just be hurt by that? So yeah, a lot of good moral lessons from this. Larry?
God said, I prevent you from sinning against me. Well, we kind of tend to forget about this. Society certainly looks at marriage as a relationship between the husband and the wife.
Yes, sir.
But the original conception of that is a three-way contract, and God is the third party. And
Yeah.
Jesus, God has put together, and let no man separate. Well, God's involved in the marriage too. It's a holy thing, and we kind of look at it society today. We're both tired of each other. Let's just go our separate ways, and we can do. But God is a party to the agreement of the group, and so it kind of I think crops up there maybe.
Yeah, good lesson. And I think even you talked about society's view of marriage, which is certainly skewed. That's an understatement. But I think even as Christians, we look at it, and our first thing might be, wait a minute, you made a promise to me. You made a vow to be faithful to me. You said, till death do us part. And that's all true, but Jesus doesn't say, what you've joined together, don't separate. He says, what God has joined together. And again, sinning against me, that, yeah, we think even as Christians, we can not really forget that, but maybe not elevate marriage the way it ought to think about, wait a minute, you made a promise to me. Well, more importantly, you made a promise to God, or in the sight of God at least. So certainly. And so, yeah, I think that we're seeing the flaws in even these good, godly men. And maybe another lesson, maybe the primary lesson is that we see God's mercy. That God doesn't just throw Abraham aside because he is flawed and has this hang up with the truth when it comes to his wife. That he is still blessing, he's still faithful to his covenant that he's made with Abraham, despite those things. Now, I'm just going to be honest. What troubles me a little bit, and it doesn't matter what troubles me, but is that there's condemnation of Pharaoh in Genesis 12. There is the warning to Abimelech here, but there's no blatant language where God just tells Abraham, hey, you idiot, quit lying. What are you doing? Don't you trust me? I told you that Sarah was going to have a child, and so don't you trust that I would see you through this? Now, I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it's not in the text, and so that's at least a head scratcher. All right, so we get through that episode, and now the child is born in chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Hold your finger there and go back to chapter 17. And somebody read verse 17, Genesis 17:17.
Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?
Well, now God answers. He answers that question. Can he? Yes. In fact, that's nothing for God. For human biology, maybe that's a problem and would be an issue, but the question is answered, and answered in a almost comical way. What's the child going to be called? Isaac. And what does Isaac mean? Anybody know the meaning of that word? Laughter. And so remember, both Abraham and Sarah both laughed at the idea that old people like them could give birth to a child. And so maybe shows that God's got a sense of humor here. He answers the question, and oh, by the way, call the kid laughter. So corny joke here, God gets the last laugh in this, in naming the child. Adam?
And it makes the Abimelech incident all the more important as far as timing, because if there had been even the slightest possibility of any contact, that there could have been questions down the line as far as whether Isaac was Abraham's or Abimelech's.
Oh, yeah.
More important why God interacted quicker and maybe prohibited Abimelech from even getting close to her.
Right. To not, no doubt that,
Sure.
yeah.
The exchange of silver and things, that was kind of a public here go kind of thing. I think that, make it a public showing.
And maybe the moral of that story is Abraham, stay at home. You always get in trouble when you go out of town, when you go to the Negev or you go to Egypt. Stay at home. So they have the child. He is circumcised at 8 days. That is going to become the pattern of Abraham's descendants. Verse 5 reminds us that he was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, so that all who hear will laugh with me. So it's all good news, isn't it? Until we've got this problem that has already been a problem, and that is of Hagar and Ishmael. Verse 8 says, the child grew and was weaned. Scholars tell us that in this culture, that was probably 3 years of age, was kind of the customary period. And so he was weaned. Let's just assume that he's around 3 at this time. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Now, if we do the math, Ishmael, he's not named here, and maybe that's intentional, but Ishmael is about 17. And so 17 and 3, and he is scoffing. We don't really know what he's scoffing at or who he's scoffing to. We assume maybe to the young child Isaac. And so now Sarah says to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman. She's got to go. There's too many cooks in the kitchen, too many children in this. And not just the idea of him scoffing, that maybe brought it to a head, but it was also, this son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son. And again, if we look at ancient custom, ancient law, that if Ishmael had stayed, he would have been a joint heir with Isaac. But ancient law and ancient custom stated that if you freed a slave, that's what Hagar was, that now that child is now unbonded from that heir relationship. And so she knew that, and so she's asking for that as well. It says in verse 11, the matter was, the New King James says, very displeasing in Abraham's sight. That's one of those where the English language softens it a little bit. When we see that word displeased in the Old Testament, when God was displeased with Israel, he would kill thousands of them. And so it wasn't that Abraham's a little upset. You maybe, and it doesn't, and this maybe is one of the only places where it says very displeased. It doesn't say God was very displeased with Israel. He was displeased, and again killed thousands of them. And so Abraham, maybe in a fit of rage here. Again, it's not that he's just like, woman, you're bothering me, a little upset about this. Again, the word very displeased kind of softens it, that Abraham was extremely disturbed by this. But God says, don't let it be displeasing to release him, because he is not going to be a part of your seed, as I have promised in the promise, but God is going to take care of him. He's still going to be provided for. He's still going to be blessed through Abraham being blessed, and he will be the father of a nation there. Then we have this another encounter with Abimelech. We won't spend a whole lot of time there. There's a disagreement about a well. We assume from reading this that maybe Abraham or his servants had dug this well, and now Abimelech takes possession of it. And so a little bit of disagreement there. But they resolved that through a covenant between the two of them, and leave in peace. Now we get to chapter 22, and this is a seminal chapter that we've waited, or they have waited all of this time after being promised in somewhat vague terms that you're going to have this great descendancy. You're going to have a lot of descendants. In fact, so much so that they can't be numbered. He has no child except maybe, are you counting this servant that was born in my house? And then come to find out, no, it's not even Ishmael, who was born through the union of Hagar and Abraham. And now finally a child is born. And what does God tell Abraham to do? Sacrifice that son. And so the language says he's going to test Abraham. Now, we know from the New Testament and other places that God doesn't tempt with evil, so it's not the idea of testing in the sense of tempting, but testing in the sense of examining his faith. And so he says, take your son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, I have to be careful here, because a lot of times in the Bible in ancient times, there are locations, maybe two separate locations that have the same name, that may be even in proximity. But we find it interesting that he says, go offer Isaac in the land of Moriah on one of the mountains. Well, we're going to find out later in 2 Chronicles, when Solomon builds the temple, he builds it on a mountain. Guess what it's called? Moriah. And so can we say definitively that it's the same location? No, because it's years later, and maybe that name has been moved to another place. You think about the city east of us here, Springfield. Now, how many Springfields are there in the United States? And so sometimes you have different names, but I find it interesting, and no reason to say it's not the same, although Scripture doesn't help us connect those dots. Maybe we connect the dots, but the Scripture doesn't say, build the temple on Mount Moriah, which is the same place where Abraham offered. It's not as clear as that. And if it is, though, here's Moriah is this location where Abraham is to offer Isaac. Moriah is labeled as the place where the temple is built, and it's just outside of that location where Jesus is crucified, God's only son. is given as a sacrifice. So anyway, as we see as Abraham's custom, he arose early in the morning. He did that when he sent away Hagar and Ishmael. Whenever Abraham has a task given by God that's unpleasant, it says he arose early in the morning. I think there's a lesson there. We've talked about that before. And so he takes with him Isaac, his son. Now, we don't know how old Isaac is at this point. Our last hint was the story where he was weaned. And again, scholars say that was probably around the age of 3. And so that's in the past. So we know he's probably older than 3. But there's a couple hints. Can you find a couple hints in the story that give us not a definite age or a year, but at least some kind of idea of his age?
Verse 6, he says, Abraham took the wood to burn offering and laid it on Isaac his son, so he was able to carry a load.
Okay, he's old enough to carry a load of wood, and some think that maybe that he laid it on his son because Abraham, who's 100, couldn't. You know, I'm so old I can't carry this. Here, son, you carry it. And so he's old enough. Now again, how old is that? How much wood is that? We don't know, but that gives us some idea that he's not 3 years old anymore. He's old enough, strong enough to be able to carry the wood that would have been required. And again, it would have had to been enough wood. I hate to be morbid and graphic, but the story is enough wood to burn a human being. And so it's not like get a couple sticks of kindling here. This had to be enough wood that we're going to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering. Mark, did you have a?
Young man, but I didn't say anything. He said it and his son, and he split wood for burnt offering. I didn't know if his son had split the wood or just.
Yeah, we have those servants there. And so, yeah, we don't know how much of this that he was doing, but we do know that, again, that he was carrying it. The other hint is in verse 7 and following, that he's old enough to be able to reason and say, wait a minute, Father, I see the wood, I see the fire, we're missing a sacrifice. And so he's old enough to have that conversation with his father, old enough to reason. A little kid's running around, he's not paying attention. The stuff just magically happens when you're a little kid. Supper just appears on the table. You didn't pay attention to where it came from, but he's old enough to be engaged intellectually to that. So it gives us a very vague idea of his age. Larry?
Abraham refers to his son as a lad. I don't know if there's a Hebrew word that meant pre-adolescent or what.
It's a vague term. It is different than the term child. Lad is different. The Hebrew term is different than child, and so again, there is a hint. As far as I know, the word lad doesn't have an age from this to this, but we're past the child stage. And again, what is that? So, but anyway, he's old enough that he's reasoning from this, and the story. Abraham, probably with a lump in his throat, says God will provide, and so he lays the child upon the altar, upon the wood, stretches out his hand, and the angel of the Lord calls to him, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son from me. And so God stops him in that. The Hebrew writer seems to indicate that Abraham thought that God would raise him from the dead. That he was going to have to go through with this, but he maybe reasoned, hey, this is the son of promise. He hasn't had children yet, and so what God will do is after I offer him, he'll bring him back. Mark and then Max. Yeah.
No way, I'm gone.
Yeah. I can outrun a 100-year-old, whatever age he's at. Yeah. Yeah. You can't even really almost wrap your mind around the dynamics of this exchange there. Yeah, profound. Yeah, Max?
Because if he was a husky 18-year-old or whatever, why Abraham probably wasn't going to be able to bind him and put him on that altar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've been talking about the low end, but yeah, maybe the high end of that would be from that. Probably pretty good reasoning. So again, accommodative language, God says, or the voice from heaven, the angel says, now I know that you fear God. Remember that back over in chapter 15, and let's make this observation. In chapter 15, when the God is making the covenant with Abram, he's known then, it says that takes him out, look at the stars, that's how many descendants you will have. It says in verse 6 of Genesis 15, he believed in the Lord and he accounted it to him for righteousness. And so he believed. Abraham hasn't done anything as far as actions yet. He believed the Lord and it was accounted to him for righteousness. And now, years later, when he's willing to offer up Isaac, despite how that just flies in the face of anything of human logic of how this story is going to play out, God says, now I know that you fear God. Now I know. Now I want us to connect those thoughts. Hold your finger here in Genesis and let's notice a couple New Testament passages. Romans chapter 4, we talked about how that Abraham is held up as the father of the faithful, the example of faith. And certainly Paul does that in the book of Romans. Look, Romans chapter 4. Verse 3 says, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. That term accounted is what it sounds like. It's an accounting term. It means to put to the account, put on the ledger of someone. So he believed God, and that was put on his account as righteousness. Again, although he had not paid any debt, he hadn't done anything to justify or to earn that accounting on his record. His faith was accounted to him for righteousness. Later in chapter 4, the same point's going to be made. Verse 22, therefore it was accounted to him for righteousness. And so just his faith in saying, I believe you, God, was accounted to him for righteousness. Now, go to the book of James. James is going to use a little bit different language, talking about the same man, the same faith. So Paul talks about that Genesis 15 quote where Abraham believed God and it was put to his account for righteousness. But now notice what James says. James chapter 2. And let's back up to verse 21. James 2, verse 21. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? That has to bring to mind what we just read, that it was accounted to him for righteousness. But then in chapter 22, when he raises the knife and he's actually going to do something, God says, now I know. Now I've seen your faith. It's been demonstrated through action, through your works. And then notice how James puts it in verse 23, the next verse. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. The scripture was fulfilled. That's the same language when we read Old Testament prophecies that there would be a child born of a virgin. He's born in Bethlehem. And we get to the New Testament and a child is born of a virgin in the city of Bethlehem. And it says that scripture was fulfilled. That's the same language that James uses and says, it was said of Abraham, he believed God and it was accounted to him to righteousness. But it wasn't fulfilled until he did something. That it was made full. It was realized in that. And I think that is so profound when it talks about our relationship and really the relationship between faith and obedience, of what obedience does. That obedience fulfills our faith. There's not separated. It's not like faith, and that's the point James is trying to see here. It's not like faith and works and they're enemies, or faith and obedience that they're enemies. That obedience fulfills that faith. I believe God. Well, that's just a statement, just like there's going to be a child born of a virgin in the city of Bethlehem. Well, that's just a statement. And it's not fulfilled until something actually happens that brings that passage to life, to fruition. And Abraham believed God, it was counted to him for righteousness, but that wasn't fulfilled until he did something. And so that obedience gives life, gives meat, puts meat on the bones, if you will, to our faith. And James uses that, and it's almost subtle language when it says that it was fulfilled, almost like it was a prophecy. We think of prophecy being fulfilled, some prediction of some future event. And that's kind of the language of Genesis. Now I know. What do you mean now you know? You already put it to his account for righteousness. And crude illustration, but since in accounting, it's this idea of when I was growing up, the store closest to our house, we lived out in the boonies, was, and you have to be from Alabama to understand this pronunciation, but it was Jordan's, Jordan, like the Jordan River, but it was Jordan's store. And you could go to Jordan's, and William and Wanza Jordan ran the store. And you could go in there, and if they knew you, you could buy something, and they had this board, and they'd say, put it on my ticket. And they'd get this little ticket, and they'd write it on there, and they'd put that little slip in alphabetical order where your name was, and they'd give you the product. Well, I hadn't paid for it, but I still got some of that ham that they sliced, and that good cheese that Wanza sliced behind the counter there. Well, I got it. Well, I didn't even pay for it. Well, the system, if it works perfectly, is they knew you were going to pay for it. They knew you were good for it, is the language we would use. And then when you came back after payday and you said, Wanza, I want to settle up my account, she'd pull those slips and you would pay it. Then that was fulfillment of that. She knew you were good for it. She'd go ahead and give it to you because she knew you would pay for it. Now, I understand there's always flaws with that system. People run off with, but again, in the perfect system, that was fulfilled. And so Abraham believed God, and it was put to his account for righteousness' sake. And then when he offers up Isaac, the text says, now I know. And in fact, James says that was fulfilled. God was saying, Abraham, I know you're good for it. I know you believe in me. But it wasn't until he actually acted on his faith that it was really fulfilled. It was really reconciled because it being put to his account. So I think we can see the relationship, the reconciled relationship between faith and what James calls works, we call obedience in those passages. So, all right, we will pick up there next time.